Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary journey through one of the most pivotal transformations in English history, the remarkable life of Cynegils, the first Christian king of Wessex, whose reign from 611 to 643 AD changed the very soul of what would become England. We'll softly explore his incredible evolution from a fierce pagan warrior king, wielding ancient Germanic weapons blessed by old gods, to a baptized Christian ruler who opened the gates of his kingdom to a revolutionary new faith. From his early battles in the mist-shrouded hills of 7th century Britain, to his historic conversion in the sacred waters of baptism, and finally, his establishment of Christianity as the spiritual foundation of the English nation, all while the gentle whispers of medieval monasteries and the soft rustle of ancient parchments carry us through this momentous period. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this fascinating transformation. Don't be shy. Your voice matters to our community. Share a gentle comment about what intrigues you most about this remarkable king's journey from paganism to Christianity. Or perhaps tell us which aspect of early English history captures your imagination. Do you find the warrior culture more fascinating? Or does the spiritual transformation speak to your heart? Your comments help me understand what resonates with you and guide me in creating more of these soothing historical tales that we can explore together. Please take a moment to like this video. It truly helps more people discover these tranquil journeys through time. And if you haven't already, subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers who find peace in history's gentle embrace. Together, we're building a wonderful community of souls who appreciate the quiet wisdom of the past. So settle in comfortably under your softest blanket, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 7th century Wessex guide you toward the most restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to our cozy circle of history lovers. Tonight, we journey back 13 centuries to witness one of the most remarkable personal and national transformations in all of English history. Cynegils, later known as King Cynegils of Wessex, the first Christian king of his realm, entered a world wrapped in the mysterious twilight that we now call the Dark Ages. But this darkness was not the absence of civilization. Rather, it was the profound transformation of an entire society, the birth pangs of what would become medieval England. The year 611 marked not merely the beginning of his reign, but a crucial moment when the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms stood at the crossroads between their Germanic past and an uncertain yet magnificent future. Picture, if you will, a land where the ghosts of Roman grandeur still haunted the countryside. Ancient roads, those masterpieces of Roman engineering, still stretched across the landscape like sleeping giants, their weathered stones carrying the footsteps of merchants, pilgrims, and warriors. Yet the legions that had built them were now just memories, and the sophisticated urban civilization they had protected had largely crumbled into romantic ruins overgrown with ivy and inhabited by owls. In this transformed Britain, Celtic Britons, Anglo-Saxon settlers, and the remnants of Romano-British civilization created a tapestry of extraordinary complexity. Each thread in this cultural weaving told its own story. The proud Britons, who still controlled the mountainous west, speaking their ancient Celtic tongues and maintaining traditions that stretch back to before Caesar's time. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had emerged from Germanic migrations, bringing with them their own gods, customs, and fierce warrior traditions. And scattered throughout the land, the descendants of Romans who had once ruled this distant province of their mighty empire. The sophisticated urban life that had characterized Roman Britain, with its bathhouses, theatres, and administrative centres, had largely faded into memory. In its place had emerged a more rural, more personal form of civilization, centered around royal halls, village settlements, and the eternal rhythm of agricultural life that bound humanity to the turning of the seasons. This was not decline, but transformation, the creation of something entirely new from the fusion of multiple cultural traditions. The kingdom that Cynegils inherited was part of what historians romantically call the Heptarchy, 7 major Anglo-Saxon realms that dominated the English landscape like rival constellations in the political sky. These kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, and Sussex, were not merely political entities, but cultural worlds unto themselves, each with its own traditions, dialects, and interpretations of what it meant to be Anglo-Saxon in post-Roman Britain. Wessex, meaning the kingdom of the West Saxons, controlled territories that would later become the heartland of English civilization. Hampshire, with its ancient forests and river valleys, Wiltshire with its mysterious stone circles and chalk downs, Dorset with its rugged coastline facing the turbulent Channel waters, and Somerset with its misty wetlands and hidden islands where legend placed Avalon itself. Yet in 611, these boundaries remained as fluid as morning mist, constantly shifting through conquest, alliance, marriage, and the ancient rite of the sword. The very origins of Wessex were shrouded in the kind of heroic legend that the Anglo-Saxons loved. According to the stories passed down through generations of royal bards, the kingdom had emerged from the legendary arrival of Cerdic and his son Cynric, warrior chieftains who supposedly landed on the Hampshire coast in the dying years of the 5th century. Whether these figures were historical reality or mythical founders mattered little to Cynegils. What mattered was the legitimacy their memory provided to his rule, and the inspiration their example offered to his own warriors. The royal house claimed direct descent from these semi-legendary warrior chieftains, and elaborate genealogies traced bloodlines back through generations of kings and war leaders, ultimately reaching back to the god Woden himself. These were not merely family trees, but sacred documents that connected earthly rulers to divine sources of authority, legitimizing their right to demand loyalty and obedience from their subjects. The landscape of Cynegils' kingdom bore little resemblance to the manicured countryside we might imagine today. Instead, it was a land of overwhelming natural power and beauty. Vast forests covered much of the territory. The great forest of Selwood stretched across the kingdom's northern boundaries like a green wall, its depths hiding wolves, bears, and perhaps more mysterious creatures that featured in the dark tales told around winter fires. To the west, the mysterious wetlands of Somerset created a watery maze of islands, causeways, and hidden channels, where druids had once performed their ancient rites, and where Christian hermits would later seek communion with God. Rivers served as the highways of this ancient world, their waters carrying not just boats, but cultures, ideas, and destinies. The Thames, greatest of English rivers, formed much of Wessex's northern boundary, its broad waters connecting the kingdom to London and the wider world beyond. The Severn, ancient and mysterious, flowed through contested borderlands, where British and Saxon cultures met and clashed. The Avon, with its gentle current, carried traders and raiders alike through the heart of the kingdom, while smaller streams like the Test and Itchen provided water for royal mills and sites for royal palaces. Settlement patterns throughout the kingdom reflected the Germanic origins of the West Saxons, while adapting to the realities of post-Roman Britain. Rather than the stone cities that had characterized Roman civilization, most people lived in small villages centered around wooden halls, whose architectural styles spoke of Northern European heritage. These settlements were not random scatterings, but carefully chosen sites that took advantage of water sources, fertile soil, defensive positions, and access to the network of roads and rivers that connected the kingdom together. The royal court itself was itinerant, a travelling centre of power that moved constantly throughout the kingdom like a magnificent caravan. Winchester, already ancient when the Romans came, served as one focal point of royal authority, its hilltop position offering both defensibility and symbolic dominance over the surrounding countryside. Dorchester-on-Thames, strategically located where the River Thames joins the Thames, provided another crucial centre of power, its position controlling river traffic and overland routes between Wessex and the neighbouring kingdoms. But royal authority in this period depended far more on personal relationships and military strength than on administrative control. The king's power travelled with him, embodied in his person, his war band, and the magnificent treasure that allowed him to reward loyalty and inspire awe. Royal halls, with their soaring timber frames and carved decorations, served as stages for the elaborate ceremonies that bound society together. The gift-giving rituals that created obligations between lord and retainer. The formal feast that celebrated victories and cemented alliances, and the bardic performances that preserved cultural memory and shaped group identity. The people of Wessex in 611 lived lives that were governed by the changing seasons and the demands of agriculture. But within this framework existed remarkable diversity and complexity. Most were free farmers, known as cools, who worked their own land and owed military service to their local lords. These were not downtrodden peasants, but proud landowners whose voices carried weight in local assemblies and whose sons might rise to positions of honour and responsibility through skill in war or wise counsel. Above the Cools stood the Thens, warrior aristocrats who formed the backbone of the king's military forces and the administrative structure of the kingdom. These men held substantial estates granted by the king in return for military service, but their relationship with their royal lord went far beyond simple contractual obligation. They were bound by personal oaths of loyalty that created emotional and spiritual as well as practical bonds, and their honour depended on their willingness to fight and die for their lord if necessary. At the summit of this social pyramid sat the king himself, a figure who was expected to embody all the virtues that Anglo-Saxon society most valued. He must be a successful war leader, capable of protecting his people from their enemies and leading them to victory in battle. He must be a generous gift giver, distributing treasure to his followers and thereby creating the complex web of obligations that held the kingdom together. He must be wise in counsel, able to settle disputes and provide guidance in times of crisis, and he must be favoured by the gods, blessed with the supernatural luck that marked true royalty. Religion in early 7th century Wessex remained fundamentally pagan, though the exact nature of Anglo-Saxon paganism continues to challenge historians and archaeologists. Unlike Christianity with its written scriptures and elaborate theology, Germanic paganism was primarily an oral tradition, its beliefs and practices passed down through generations of storytellers, priests, and ordinary believers. What we know suggests a rich and complex religious worldview that saw the divine everywhere in the natural world. The pantheon of Anglo-Saxon gods included mighty figures whose names still echo in our modern world. Woden, the one-eyed god of war and wisdom, claimed particular reverence from royal houses who traced their genealogies back to his divine lineage. Thunor, wielder of the mighty hammer, protected both gods and men from the forces of chaos that constantly threatened to overwhelm the ordered world. Frigg governed the domestic sphere and the bonds of kinship that held society together, while Tu embodied the warrior's courage and the sacred nature of oaths and treaties. These deities were not distant, abstract forces, but active participants in human affairs, Warriors carried weapons blessed by Woden's priests into battle. Farmers made offerings to Thuna for favourable weather, and mothers invoked Frigg's protection for their children. Sacred groves dotted the landscape, their ancient trees serving as natural cathedrals where priests performed rituals that connected the human and divine worlds. Holy springs bubbled up from the earth, their waters carrying prayers and offerings to the realm of the gods. Archaeological evidence reveals the sophistication of pagan religious practices in early 7th century Wessex. Elaborate burial rituals placed the dead in graves surrounded by the goods they would need in the afterlife. Weapons for warriors, jewelry for women, tools for craftsmen. These burials were not just practical preparations for death, but complex religious ceremonies that reinforced social relationships and demonstrated beliefs about the nature of existence beyond the grave. The material culture of Cynegils' kingdom reflected both Germanic traditions and the evolving English identity that was emerging from the fusion of multiple cultural influences. Skilled craftsmen worked in wood, metal, bone, and other materials, creating everything from simple farming tools to elaborate jewelry and weapons that could serve as royal gifts. The famous burial at Sutton Hoo in East Anglia, though outside Wessex, gives us a glimpse of the wealth and sophistication possible in Anglo-Saxon royal courts. Gold and garnet jewelry showcased techniques that combined Germanic artistic traditions with influences from across the known world. Pattern-welded swords represented the pinnacle of the metalworker's art, their twisted steel cores creating decorative patterns that were both beautiful and symbolic of the weapon's supernatural power. Elaborate shields, helmets, and other military equipment proclaimed the status of their owners while providing practical protection in the deadly business of warfare. Trade networks connected Wessex to the broader world despite the kingdom's seemingly isolated position. Merchants brought exotic goods from Frankish Gaul, fine wines, luxury textiles, and precious objects that could enhance royal prestige. From the Rhine Valley came pottery and glassware that graced the tables of the wealthy. Byzantine silks and other Eastern luxuries filtered through the complex trade routes that connected Britain to the Mediterranean world and beyond. The great trading settlement of Hamwick, near modern Southampton, was beginning to develop as a crucial link between Wessex and the continental economy. Here, foreign merchants established warehouses and workshops, while English traders prepared goods for export to markets across the Channel. The town's location at the head of Southampton Water provided easy access to both river and sea roads, making it a natural hub for international commerce. Language in early 7th century Wessex reflected the complex cultural inheritance of the kingdom. Latin, the language of the former Roman administration and the Christian Church, persisted among the educated elite and in official documents. But the common tongue was Old English, a Germanic language that had already begun its evolution into something distinctly English through contact with Celtic, British, and Latin influences. This was still primarily an oral culture, where memory and spoken tradition carried the weight that written documents would later bear. Skilled bards preserved heroic poetry that celebrated the deeds of legendary heroes and historical kings. Legal customs, genealogical records, and practical knowledge were all transmitted through oral tradition, creating a rich cultural heritage that bound communities together through shared stories and common values. The first stirrings of written vernacular literature were still generations away, but the foundations were being laid through the preservation of oral traditions that would later be committed to parchment by monastic scribes. These stories, tales of heroes and monsters, of loyalty and betrayal, of the triumph of good over evil, would eventually find their highest expression in poems like Beowulf. But in Cynegils' time, they lived only in the voices of the bards who sang them in royal halls on winter evenings. The political landscape of 611 presented both extraordinary opportunities and daunting challenges for a new king of Wessex. To the north, the Kingdom of Mercia was rising under ambitious rulers who sought to extend their influence over neighbouring realms and establish themselves as overlords of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria, far to the north but connected by the network of rivers and Roman roads, had recently emerged as a major power under King Ethelfrith, whose military successes had established his reputation as one of the most formidable warriors of his generation. Meanwhile, the British kingdoms of Wales and the West Country maintained their independence with fierce determination, viewing the Anglo-Saxon realms as foreign invaders to be resisted at every opportunity. These Celtic kingdoms possessed their own rich traditions, their own warrior cultures, and their own religious beliefs that made them natural enemies of the Germanic newcomers. The frontier between British and Saxon territory was not a line on a map, but a zone of constant conflict where raids and counter-raids shaped the daily lives of border communities. Kent, the most sophisticated of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms due to its close ties with Frankish Gaul and its strategic position controlling access to the continent, had already begun experimenting with Christianity under King Ethelbert and his Frankish Queen Bertha. The mission of Augustine of Canterbury in 597 had established a foothold for the new faith, but its influence had yet to spread significantly beyond Kentish borders. Most of England remained stubbornly pagan, and the cultural divide between Christian and pagan kingdoms added another layer of complexity to an already intricate political situation. This was the world that awaited Cynegils as he ascended to the throne of Wessex, a realm balanced precariously between ancient traditions and emerging possibilities, between the familiar patterns of warrior kingship and the transformative potential of new ideas flowing in from the wider world. His reign would witness some of the most significant changes in English history, but in 611, those changes lay hidden in the future, like seeds waiting for the right season to sprout and transform the landscape forever. The challenge facing any new king in this environment was immense. He had to prove himself worthy of the loyalty he claimed, demonstrate his favor with the gods through military success, and navigate the complex web of relationships that connected his kingdom to its neighbors. Failure could mean not just personal death, but the destruction of his kingdom and the enslavement or slaughter of his people. Success, on the other hand, could lead to glory, wealth, and the kind of legendary status that would ensure his memory lived on in the songs of future generations. The path that led Cynegils to the throne of Wessex was paved with the blood of kinsmen and the tears of mourning women, for Anglo-Saxon succession was never a gentle process. In this warrior society, where kings were expected to prove their worth through strength of arm and wisdom in council, the crown did not simply pass from father to eldest son like some precious heirloom. Instead, it became the prize in a complex game of politics, genealogy, and raw military power that could transform princes into corpses as easily as it elevated warriors to royal status. The exact circumstances of Cynegils' rise remain shrouded in the mist that surrounds so much of 7th century history, but the patterns are clear enough. Anglo-Saxon kingship followed the principle of royal worthiness rather than strict primogeniture. The throne went to the most suitable adult male from the royal family, chosen through a process that combined bloodline claims, political support, and demonstrated military capability. This system ensured that weak or incompetent rulers rarely held power for long, but it also meant that every succession was potentially a crisis that could tear the kingdom apart. Cynegils claimed descent from the royal house through his father Ciel, whose own path to the throne perfectly illustrated the turbulent nature of West Saxon politics. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that invaluable collection of annals that preserves so much of early English history, presents a genealogy tracing Cynegils back through Seal, Cutha, and Cynric to the legendary founder Cerdic himself. But these genealogies, while politically crucial, often reflected political necessity as much as biological reality. What mattered was not just blood, but the ability to make that blood claim stick through force of arms and political acumen. The young Cynegils would have grown up in the royal court, absorbing the complex lessons necessary for successful kingship through observation, instruction, and gradual participation in the activities that defined royal life. Physical prowess with sword and spear formed the foundation of any prince's education. A king who could not lead his warriors in battle, who could not demonstrate his personal courage and skill in combat, would not long retain his throne in this martial society. But weaponcraft, crucial as it was, represented only one part of the curriculum that prepared future kings for their destiny. The education of a royal prince encompassed far more than simple military training. Future kings learned the intricate arts of diplomacy, the subtle calculations that governed relationships between kingdoms, and the delicate negotiations that could prevent war or ensure favorable terms when conflict became inevitable. They studied the complex web of obligations that bound lord to retainer, understanding how gifts created loyalty and how honor could be both earned and lost through seemingly minor actions. The oral traditions of the Anglo-Saxons served as both entertainment and education, with heroic poetry teaching lessons about proper royal behavior, while preserving the cultural memory that defined group identity. Young princes listened to tales of legendary kings like Hrothgar and Beowulf, learning from these examples what it meant to be a successful ruler. They heard stories of treasure-giving and hospitality, of loyalty rewarded and treachery punished, of the supernatural favor that marked true royalty, and the terrible consequences that followed those who offended the gods. Archaeological evidence from royal burials of this period provides tantalizing glimpses of the martial splendor that surrounded Anglo-Saxon princes and kings. Pattern-welded swords with precious metal hilts represented not merely weapons, but symbols of royal status, their elaborate decorations proclaiming the owner's right to command and his willingness to defend that right with his life. Elaborate helmets with protective face masks transformed warriors into terrifying figures that seemed more divine than human, while shields decorated with gold and precious stones served as both defensive equipment and artistic masterpieces. For a prince like Cynegils, such equipment was far more than ceremonial display. It represented the tools of his trade as war leader and the visible symbols of his claim to royal authority. The weight of a sword in his hand connected him to generations of warrior kings who had carved their kingdoms from the chaos of post-Roman Britain. The protection offered by helm and mail shirt could mean the difference between victory and death in the brutal realities of 7th century warfare. The political situation that brought Cynegils to the throne around 611 likely involved the death of his predecessor Ceolwulf, though the exact relationship between the two men remains unclear in the fragmentary sources that have survived from this distant period. What is certain is that Cynegils' accession represented far more than a simple inheritance. It marked the beginning of a reign that would transform not just Wessex, but the entire religious and cultural landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. The ceremony of royal inauguration in pagan Anglo-Saxon society was a magnificent affair that combined political necessity with religious ritual and public celebration. The new king would be acclaimed by his warriors and nobles, their voices raised in the traditional shouts that proclaimed his worthiness to rule. Weapons would be struck against shields in rhythmic salutes that echoed across the landscape like thunder, announcing the birth of a new reign to gods and men alike. Religious elements of the inauguration connected the new king to the divine sources of his authority. priests would invoke the blessings of Woden and the other gods, performing ancient rituals that sought to ensure supernatural favor for the new reign. The royal throne itself was more than furniture. It was a sacred seat that connected its occupant to the spiritual forces that governed the fate of kingdoms and the destiny of peoples. The first months of Cynegils' reign would have been crucial in establishing his authority and demonstrating his fitness to rule. Early Anglo-Saxon kings faced what historians call the expectation of victory, the need to prove themselves worthy of divine favor through military success, and the acquisition of treasure that could be distributed to their followers. Failure to meet these expectations could quickly lead to challenges from rival claimants or the defection of key supporters to more promising leaders. The royal court that surrounded the new king reflected the intensely personal nature of Anglo-Saxon kingship, rather than the bureaucratic apparatus that would characterize later medieval governments. Cynegils' administration consisted primarily of personal relationships with trusted retainers who had sworn individual oaths of loyalty to their lord. These men, known as gesits or companions, formed the core of both his military forces and his government, serving as bodyguards, advisors, and representatives of royal authority throughout the kingdom. The institution of royal companionship created bonds that went far beyond simple employer-employee relationships. The king's companions had sworn sacred oaths that bound them to their lord, through fire and flood, through famine and plenty, in victory and defeat. In return, they expected protection, generous gifts, and opportunities for glory that would enhance their own reputations and ensure their places in the heroic poetry that preserved the memory of great deeds. The rhythm of royal life in early 7th century Wessex followed patterns established by both practical necessity and ancient tradition. During the summer months, when travel was easier and grass was available for the horses that carried the royal retinue, the king and his court moved constantly throughout the kingdom. This itinerant kingship served multiple crucial purposes. It allowed the king to maintain personal contact with local nobles and their followers, to consume the food rents owed by various royal estates, and to demonstrate royal presence and authority throughout the realm. These royal progresses were magnificent affairs that brought excitement and ceremony to communities that might otherwise see little of the wider world beyond their local boundaries. The approach of the royal court would be announced by the sound of horns and the sight of banners fluttering in the wind, while the thunder of hoofbeats proclaimed the arrival of power and majesty. Local nobles would gather to pay their respects and renew their oaths of loyalty, while craftsmen and merchants would display their finest goods in hopes of attracting royal patronage. Winter months typically found the court settled in one of the major royal centres, where the long, dark evenings provided opportunities for the cultural activities that bound the warrior community together and reinforced the shared values that held the kingdom united. The Great Hall, with its soaring timber roof and carved decorations, became a theatre where the drama of royal power played out in elaborate ceremonies of gift-giving, oath-swearing, and storytelling. These winter gatherings were far more than mere entertainment. They were essential elements in the maintenance of royal authority and social cohesion. The Great Hall echoed with heroic poetry that recounted the deeds of ancestors and contemporary heroes, while skilled harpers provided musical accompaniment that enhanced the emotional impact of the stories. The distribution of treasure during these ceremonies reinforced the bonds between lord and retainer that held the kingdom together, with each gift creating or acknowledging obligations that would be remembered for years to come. Cynegils' court would have attracted not just warriors, but skilled craftsmen, merchants, and occasional foreign visitors who brought news and exotic goods from distant lands. The king's patronage supported smiths who could forge pattern-welded swords and elaborate jewelry, while foreign traders brought luxury items that could be redistributed as marks of royal favour. Even at this early date, contacts with Frankish Gaul and other continental kingdoms brought new ideas and influences into the Anglo-Saxon world. The challenge of establishing legitimate authority extended far beyond the immediate circle of the royal court, to encompass the complex network of relationships that connected the king to nobles throughout his realm. Local aristocrats controlled their own territories and followers, acknowledging royal overlordship while maintaining considerable independence in the management of their own affairs. These men possessed their own military forces, their own sources of wealth, and their own local loyalties that had to be carefully balanced against their obligations to the crown. A wise king, like Cynegils, cultivated the support of these local magnates through a sophisticated combination of gifts, marriage alliances, and shared military ventures that served their interests as well as his own. The distribution of royal favour had to be carefully calculated to reward loyalty without creating jealousy, to acknowledge achievement without establishing precedents that might prove difficult to maintain, and to demonstrate royal generosity without depleting the treasury that provided the foundation for future largesse. Marriage politics played a crucial role in cementing political relationships, both within Wessex and with neighbouring kingdoms that could serve as allies or enemies depending on the shifting currents of diplomatic advantage. Royal daughters became valuable diplomatic assets, their marriages sealing alliances that could determine the balance of power for generations. The wives and daughters of local nobles, meanwhile, could bring new territories and followers into the royal sphere of influence through carefully arranged unions that satisfied both political and personal considerations. The legal system that Cynegils inherited was based on personal relationships and customary law, rather than the written codes that would later characterize medieval jurisprudence. Justice was dispensed at assemblies where the king and his nobles heard disputes and pronounced judgments based on precedent, compensation, and the maintenance of social harmony, rather than abstract principles of punishment or deterrence. The concept of the king's peace gradually extended royal authority into areas that had previously been governed purely by local custom, but this evolution was still in its early stages during the opening years of Cynegils' reign. Economic foundations of royal power rested on a complex combination of agricultural estates, tribute from subject peoples, and the profits of war that provided the treasure necessary for maintaining warrior loyalty. The king's personal lands provided food for his household and followers, while tribute and plunder supplied the gold, silver, and precious objects that served as the currency of political relationships. Trade was beginning to generate additional revenue, but the fundamentally agricultural nature of the economy meant that royal wealth ultimately depended on control of productive land and the people who worked it. As Cynegils consolidated his position on the throne of Wessex, he would have been acutely aware that kingship in the 7th century was an extraordinarily precarious business, where even the most successful rulers lived under the constant shadow of violent death. Royal mortality rates were shockingly high, with many kings dying in battle through political assassination, or from the diseases that ravaged populations with little understanding of medicine or sanitation. Success required not just military skill and political acumen, but also the kind of supernatural luck that marked those favored by the gods. The expectations placed upon Anglo-Saxon kings were simultaneously inspiring and terrifying. They were expected to be successful war leaders who could protect their people from external enemies and lead them to victory in the battles that would provide treasure and glory for the entire kingdom. They were expected to be generous gift givers whose distribution of treasure would create the complex web of obligations that held society together. They were expected to be wise counselors who could settle disputes and provide guidance in times of crisis. And above all, They were expected to be blessed by divine favor, marked by the supernatural signs that distinguish true royalty from mere pretenders. The weight of these expectations shaped every aspect of royal behavior and decision-making. Every military campaign carried the risk of defeat that could destroy not just royal prestige, but the king's very life. Every gift given or withheld sent messages about royal favor that could influence the loyalty of crucial supporters. Every judgment rendered in legal disputes established precedents that could be cited for generations. Every public appearance provided opportunities for both triumph and humiliation that could determine the future of the dynasty. For Cynegils, the early years of his reign represented a crucial testing period, during which he had to prove himself worthy of the crown he claimed and establish the foundation for the remarkable transformation that would define his place in history. The pagan warrior who ascended the throne in 611 would, within a generation, become the first Christian king of Wessex and the founding father of English Christianity. But that transformation lay in the future, hidden behind the immediate challenges of establishing royal authority and surviving in the deadly game of 7th century politics. The early years of Cynegils' reign unfolded in a world still completely dominated by the ancient gods of his Germanic ancestors, where the crash of weapons blessed by pagan priests echoed across battlefields soaked with blood spilled in honor of Woden, where sacred groves whispered with the voices of spirits, and where the very foundations of royal authority rested upon divine favor granted by deities whose names were spoken with reverence and fear in equal measure. This was not the crude superstition that later Christian writers would dismiss, but a sophisticated religious system that had sustained Germanic peoples through centuries of migration, conquest, and cultural transformation. The pagan beliefs of 7th century Wessex were deeply integrated into every aspect of daily life, from the seasonal festivals that marked the agricultural year to the elaborate funeral rites that prepared warriors for their journey to the halls of the gods. Royal authority itself was understood to flow from divine sources, with kings claiming descent from Woden and other deities who granted both the right to rule and the supernatural luck necessary for success in battle. Archaeological evidence reveals the complexity and sophistication of pagan religious practices in early 7th century Wessex. Sacred sites scattered throughout the kingdom served as centers for religious observance that connected human communities to the divine realm in ways that were both practical and mystical. Hilltop shrines commanded sweeping views of the surrounding countryside, their elevated positions symbolizing the connection between earth and sky, while providing natural theaters for the religious dramas that marked important occasions in the ritual calendar. Sacred springs bubbled up from the earth at sites throughout the kingdom, their dark waters carrying prayers and offerings to the realm of the gods. These natural shrines were often enhanced with wooden structures or stone arrangements that focused ritual activity and provided gathering places for communities that might be scattered across miles of countryside. The offerings cast into these holy waters, weapons, jewelry, tools and food, speak to the intimate relationship between the human and divine worlds in pagan Anglo-Saxon society. The pantheon of Anglo-Saxon paganism included mighty figures whose influence extended far beyond religious observance into the practical realities of warfare, agriculture, and social organization. Woden, the one-eyed god of war and wisdom, claimed particular reverence from royal houses who traced their genealogies back to his divine lineage. This connection was not merely symbolic, but fundamental to royal authority. Kings ruled by divine right, not because of abstract theological principles, but because they were literally descended from the gods themselves. Thuna, wielder of the mighty hammer that could shatter mountains and drive away the forces of chaos, protected both gods and men from the supernatural enemies that constantly threatened the ordered world. Warriors carried amulets bearing his symbol into battle, while farmers invoked his power to bring the thunderstorms that watered their crops and drove away the droughts that could destroy entire harvests. His hammer became one of the most powerful symbols in Anglo-Saxon culture, representing not just divine protection, but the cosmic struggle between order and chaos that gave meaning to human existence. Frigg governed the domestic sphere and the bonds of kinship that held society together, her influence extending from the great halls of kings to the humblest cottages where mothers raised their children and wives managed their households. She presided over the ceremonies that marked births, marriages, and other crucial transitions in human life, while her protection was invoked for women in childbirth and families threatened by disease or misfortune. The importance of kinship ties in Anglo-Saxon society made her worship central to social cohesion and community identity. These deities were not distant, abstract forces dwelling in some remote heaven, but active participants in human affairs who could be approached through proper ritual and whose favor could be earned through appropriate offerings and behavior. Warriors carried weapons blessed by Woden's priests into battle, confident that divine power flowed through the steel that would decide their fate. Farmers made offerings to Tuna for favorable weather, understanding that their survival depended on the god's willingness to send rain and sunshine in proper measure. Mothers invoked Frigg's protection for their children, knowing that the goddess watched over all who honored the sacred bonds of family and kinship. The royal court itself served as the premier center of pagan religious activity, with the king fulfilling roles as both political leader and high priest of his people. This combination of secular and sacred authority was fundamental to Anglo-Saxon kingship, making the ruler responsible not just for military success and political stability, but for maintaining the proper relationship between his kingdom and the divine powers that governed its destiny. Royal ceremonies combined political and religious elements in elaborate rituals that reinforced both royal authority and cosmic order. Cynegils' early military campaigns demonstrate both his understanding of traditional warrior kingship and his remarkable skill at the practical arts of war. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in 614, just a few years into his reign, he and his son Cuichelm achieved a spectacular victory against British forces at a place called Beandun, possibly in Devon or Somerset. This battle resulted in what the Chronicle describes as a massacre of over 2,000 enemy warriors, a staggering slaughter by the standards of early medieval warfare that established Cynegils' reputation as a formidable war leader and demonstrated his favor with the gods of battle. The scale of this victory suggests careful planning and superior tactics, rather than simple good fortune. Anglo-Saxon warfare in this period was far from the random barbarian raids that later propaganda might suggest, but involved sophisticated strategies that took advantage of terrain, seasonal conditions, and detailed intelligence about enemy movements and capabilities. The defeat of such a large British force required not just courage and skill, but the kind of tactical genius that marked the greatest war leaders of the age. Such victories served multiple crucial purposes beyond simple territorial expansion. They provided the treasure and prestige necessary for maintaining warrior loyalty, demonstrated the king's favor with the war gods who determined the outcome of battles, and established his reputation among both allies and enemies as a ruler who could deliver the victories that brought wealth and glory to his followers. The distribution of battle spoils allowed Cynegils to reward his warriors with gold, silver, weapons, and other precious items, reinforcing the bonds of loyalty that held his war band together and attracting new recruits eager to share in future successes. The victory at Beandun also served important religious functions within the context of pagan Anglo-Saxon society. Success in battle was understood as evidence of divine favour, proof that the king maintained the proper relationship with the gods and that his warriors fought under supernatural protection. The elaborate ceremonies that followed major victories included offerings to the war gods who had granted success, the dedication of captured weapons and treasure to divine patrons, and the performance of ritual acts that reinforced the sacred nature of royal authority. The tactics employed in these early campaigns reflected the military traditions of the Anglo-Saxon warrior elite, refined through generations of conflict and adapted to the specific conditions of post-Roman Britain. Heavy infantry formed the backbone of most armies, armed with spears, swords and shields, and trained to fight in the disciplined formations that could break enemy lines through coordinated advance and overwhelming force. The warrior aristocracy rode to battle on horseback, but typically fought on foot, their superior equipment and training making them formidable opponents in the hand-to-hand combat that decided most engagements. The famous Anglo-Saxon shield wall represented the culmination of these tactical traditions, a formation in which warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping to create an almost impenetrable barrier against enemy attacks. Success in shield wall combat required not just individual courage and skill, but perfect coordination between warriors who had trained together for years and who trusted their companions with their lives. The psychological impact of a well-disciplined shield wall advancing across a battlefield was often as important as its physical effectiveness, breaking enemy morale before the actual fighting began. Strategic considerations also shaped Cynegils' military activities during this crucial early period of his reign. The victory at Beandun appears to have been part of a broader campaign to secure Wessex's western borders against British kingdoms that still controlled much of what is now Devon, Cornwall, and parts of Somerset. These Celtic realms remained fiercely independent and deeply hostile to Anglo-Saxon expansion, requiring constant vigilance and periodic military intervention to prevent them from threatening the heartland of the West Saxon kingdom. The relationship between pagan religious observance and military success created a powerful feedback loop that shaped both individual behavior and royal policy throughout Anglo-Saxon society. Victories in battle were seen as evidence of divine favor, while defeats might indicate that the gods had been offended through improper ritual observance, broken oaths, or other violations of the sacred order. Cynegils, as both war leader and chief priest of his people, bore ultimate responsibility for maintaining the proper relationship with the divine powers that governed the fate of kingdoms. Ritual aspects of warfare in pagan Anglo-Saxon society extended far beyond simple battlefield tactics to encompass elaborate ceremonies that began long before armies marched and continued long after battles ended. Weapons were blessed by priests who invoked divine protection and supernatural power, while warriors underwent purification rites that prepared them spiritually, as well as physically, for the trials ahead. The very act of going to war was understood as a form of religious observance, a participation in the cosmic struggle between order and chaos that gave ultimate meaning to human existence. The famous Anglo-Saxon practice of weapon decoration reflected this integration of religious and military elements. Swords, spears, shields, and helmets were often adorned with symbols that invoked divine protection or terrified enemies with their supernatural associations. The elaborate helmet from Sutton Hoo, with its intricate decorations depicting warriors, animals, and mythological scenes, gives us some sense of how the material culture of war could serve spiritual as well as practical purposes. Pattern-welded swords, with their distinctive wavy patterns created by twisting iron and steel rods together during forging, were not merely superior weapons, but sacred objects that embodied supernatural power. These blades often received individual names that reflected their legendary qualities, Gram or Naegling, or other titles that suggested their almost animate nature. The possession of such a weapon marked its owner as a warrior of exceptional status, while providing tangible connection to the divine forces that governed victory and defeat. The practice of gift-giving, so central to Anglo-Saxon political culture, reached its highest expression in the aftermath of successful military campaigns. Cynegils would have distributed captured treasure among his followers according to their rank and service, but these gifts were far more than simple payment for military service rendered. They created and reinforced the personal bonds between lord and retainer that formed the foundation of royal authority, while demonstrating the king's continuing favour with the gods who provided victory and plunder. The composition of Cynegils' warband reflected both traditional patterns of warrior recruitment and the specific challenges facing Wessex in the early 7th century. The core of his forces consisted of his personal retainers, professional warriors who lived at court and formed his immediate bodyguard. These men had sworn individual oaths of loyalty to their king and expected to fight and die at his side if necessary. Their equipment and training represented the pinnacle of Anglo-Saxon military technology, while their courage and skill in battle earned them places in the heroic poetry that preserved the memory of great deeds. Beyond this inner circle of royal companions, the king could call upon the broader warrior aristocracy of Wessex, those who held land in return for military service and who brought their own followers to royal campaigns. These men formed the backbone of larger armies, providing both heavy infantry for major battles and cavalry for reconnaissance and pursuit operations. Their local knowledge and established relationships with their own followers made them invaluable for the kind of sustained campaigning that characterized serious military operations. Training and equipment for these warriors represented a significant investment of resources and time that reflected both the importance of military success and the wealth available to support professional fighting men. A fully equipped Anglo-Saxon warrior needed not just weapons and armor, but the years of practice necessary to use them effectively in the chaos and terror of battle. The production of pattern-welded swords, elaborate shields, protective mail shirts, and the other equipment of war required skilled craftsmen and expensive materials, making the warrior class a relatively small but highly effective military elite. The logistics of early medieval warfare imposed their own constraints on royal military policy that had to be carefully considered in planning any major campaign. Armies could only be kept in the field for limited periods before agricultural concerns forced warriors to return to their estates and families. Most campaigns were therefore brief affairs, aimed at achieving specific objectives before winter weather or harvest demands made continued operations impossible or prohibitively expensive. Seasonal patterns shaped military activity throughout the Anglo-Saxon world, with major campaigns typically launched in late spring or early summer when travel was easier and supplies more readily available. The need to coordinate military operations with agricultural cycles meant that kings had to balance their desire for conquest against the practical requirements of maintaining the economic foundation that supported their kingdoms. Communication and intelligence gathering in this pre-literate society depended heavily on personal networks and traditional knowledge that had been accumulated over generations of contact between neighboring communities. Cynegils would have relied on merchants, traveling craftsmen, and diplomatic contacts to provide information about the activities of neighboring the kingdoms and the movements of potential enemies. Local knowledge of terrain, seasonal patterns, and potential allies or enemies was equally crucial for successful military planning. The integration of military and religious activities found its most dramatic expression in the pre-battle rituals that sought to ensure divine favor for the coming conflict. These ceremonies might include sacrifices to war gods, the blessing of weapons and standards, and the performance of traditional chants or songs designed to inspire courage in friendly warriors while striking terror into the hearts of enemies. The famous Anglo-Saxon war cry, echoing across battlefields like the howling of wolves, serve both practical and supernatural purposes in the brutal business of early medieval warfare. Victory in battle brought not just immediate material rewards, but lasting enhancement to royal prestige and authority that could influence political relationships for years or even generations. Successful war leaders attracted followers from neighboring kingdoms, expanded their territorial control, and gained the respect of both allies and enemies who recognized their prowess and their favor with the gods. For Cynegils, early military successes like the triumph at Beandun established his reputation as a formidable king and laid the foundation for the more complex political challenges that would characterize his later reign. The political landscape of 7th century Britain resembled a vast and deadly chess game where multiple kingdoms maneuvered for advantage across a board marked by shifting alliances, ancient grievances, territorial ambitions, and personal rivalries that could explode into warfare at a moment's notice. For Cynegils, the greatest challenges to his kingdom's independence and his own survival came not from the British kingdoms he had successfully defeated in his early campaigns, but from his fellow Anglo-Saxon rulers who shared his cultural background while competing ruthlessly for supremacy over what was slowly emerging as the English nation. The Kingdom of Mercia, centered in the rich agricultural lands of the Midlands, represented the most immediate and persistent threat to West Saxon independence. Under the leadership of brilliant and ruthlessly ambitious kings like Penda, Mercia was expanding its influence in all directions with the systematic determination of a conquering empire. This expansionist policy brought Mercian forces into direct and increasingly violent conflict with Wessex along their shared border, creating a volatile frontier where raids and counter-raids became routine facts of political life that shaped the daily existence of border communities. Penda of Mercia stands out in the historical record as one of the most formidable warriors and political strategists of his generation, a ruler whose military genius and diplomatic skill transformed a relatively minor kingdom into the dominant power of central England. His reputation for ferocity in battle was matched by his cunning in politics, as he skillfully exploited the rivalries between other kingdoms to advance Mercian interests, while avoiding the kind of decisive confrontation that might destroy his carefully built power base. The fundamental incompatibility between Mercian ambitions and West Saxon independence became increasingly clear during the early years of Cynegils' reign. While both kingdoms shared Anglo-Saxon cultural traditions and similar governmental structures, their competing claims to territorial control and political hegemony made conflict virtually inevitable. The rich river valleys and fertile agricultural lands that lay between their core territories became contested zones where the balance of power could shift dramatically based on the outcome of individual battles or the success of particular raids. These tensions escalated dramatically in the 620s, when Cynegils' son, Cuicum, attempted to orchestrate one of the most audacious political assassinations in Anglo-Saxon history, the murder of Edwin, the powerful king of Northumbria. This bold but ultimately unsuccessful plot represented far more than simple aggression between rival kingdoms. It was a carefully calculated strategic attempt to prevent the formation of a dangerous alliance between Mercia and Northumbria that could have crushed Wessex between two hostile powers like a nut in a vice. The assassination attempt against Edwin involved sending a skilled killer disguised as a messenger to the Northumbrian court. where royal security was necessarily balanced against the requirements of diplomatic protocol and royal hospitality. According to the detailed account preserved by the Venerable Bede, whose ecclesiastical history provides our most reliable source for these events, the assassin managed to approach close enough to Edwin to wound him with a poisoned weapon, before being cut down by the king's alert bodyguards. The weapon used in this assassination attempt was reportedly a double-edged dagger, whose blade had been treated with poison, making even a superficial wound potentially fatal to the intended victim. This detail suggests sophisticated planning and access to exotic materials that were not readily available in Anglo-Saxon England, indicating that the plot may have involved continental contacts or specialized knowledge of toxins and their preparation. The failure of the assassination attempt had far-reaching consequences that extended far beyond the immediate diplomatic crisis it created between Wessex and Northumbria. Edwin's survival transformed him from a potential neutral party in the growing conflict between Wessex and Mercia into an implacable enemy of the West Saxon kingdom, providing him with both moral justification and political necessity for military intervention in West Saxon affairs. The failed plot also demonstrated the lengths to which Cynegils and his advisors were willing to go to protect their kingdom's independence, revealing a level of desperation that suggested awareness of the growing threats facing Wessex. Edwin's response to the assassination attempt came swiftly and devastatingly, demonstrating both the reach and power of the Northumbrian kingdom under his leadership. In 626, Northumbrian forces launched a massive punitive expedition against Wessex that brought the reality of warfare directly to the heart of Cynegils' kingdom. This campaign was not a simple border raid, but a full-scale invasion designed to inflict maximum damage on West Saxon military capacity, while demonstrating the terrible consequences of opposing Northumbrian interests. The Northumbrian invasion resulted in what the sources describe as a catastrophic massacre of West Saxon nobility, with 5 princes of the royal house reportedly killed in the fighting that accompanied Edwin's campaign. This devastating blow eliminated not only potential rivals to Cynegils' throne, but also many of the experienced war leaders who formed the backbone of West Saxon military organization. The loss of so many high-ranking nobles in a single campaign significantly weakened the kingdom's ability to resist future aggression, while creating opportunities for ambitious survivors to advance their own positions within the reduced hierarchy. The death of 5 royal princes in the course of Edwin's campaign represents one of the most significant single disasters in early West Saxon history, comparable to the destruction of entire dynasties that occasionally marked the violent politics of Anglo-Saxon England. These men were not merely ceremonial figures, but active military commanders and political leaders, whose loss would be felt for years in both battlefield effectiveness and administrative capability. The tactical details of the fighting that resulted in such devastating losses for the West Saxon nobility remain frustratingly obscure in the surviving sources, but the scale of the disaster suggests that Edwin's forces achieved a level of tactical surprise or strategic advantage that prevented effective West Saxon resistance. The Northumbrians may have exploited superior intelligence about West Saxon dispositions, or they may have simply overwhelmed their opponents through superior numbers and more effective coordination of their military forces. Recovery from the disaster of 626 required both time and extremely careful political maneuvering, as Cynegils struggled to rebuild his military forces while simultaneously managing the complex diplomatic situation created by the failed assassination plot. The need to avoid further confrontation with Edwin's formidable war machine meant that West Saxon foreign policy became increasingly cautious and defensive during the late 620s, a period when the kingdom's enemies were growing stronger and more aggressive. The challenge of rebuilding West Saxon military capacity after such devastating losses was complicated by the need to maintain internal stability, while external threats continued to multiply. The death of so many experienced nobles created opportunities for ambitious survivors to advance their own positions, but it also eliminated much of the institutional knowledge and personal relationships that held the kingdom's military organization together. New leaders had to be trained, new alliances forged, and new strategies developed to meet the changing threats facing the kingdom. The climactic confrontation between Wessex and Mercia came in 628 at the Battle of Cirencester, a struggle that would determine the balance of power in central England for generations to come. Cirencester itself was a strategically crucial location, an ancient Roman city whose massive walls and strategic position, controlling important roads between the Thames Valley and the Severn, made it one of the most valuable prizes in Anglo-Saxon politics. Control of Cirencester would give the victor significant advantages in any future conflict, making the coming battle a test of strength that neither kingdom could afford to lose. The approach to this decisive confrontation would have been marked by the elaborate preparations that characterized major military campaigns in Anglo-Saxon society. Both armies would have included not just professional warriors, but also levies of free farmers who owed military service to their lords, creating forces that represented entire kingdoms rather than simply royal war bands. The religious ceremonies that preceded such battles would have been particularly elaborate, with priests from both sides invoking divine favor and performing the rituals that were believed to influence the outcome of the coming struggle. King Penda of Mercia brought to this confrontation all the military resources of his rapidly expanding kingdom, along with the tactical genius that had already established his reputation as one of the most formidable warriors of his generation. Penda's forces likely included not just Mercian warriors, but also contingents from subject peoples and allied kingdoms, creating a formidable army that reflected Mercia's growing dominance over much of central England. The diversity of this force would have presented both advantages and challenges, providing superior numbers while requiring careful coordination to prevent the confusion that could doom even the largest army. Cynegils and Cuichelm led the West Saxon forces into this crucial battle with the desperate courage of men who understood that defeat could mean the end of their kingdom's independence and possibly their own lives. The West Saxon army would have included the survivors of previous campaigns along with new recruits drawn from throughout the kingdom, but contemporary accounts suggest that they were significantly outnumbered by their Mercian opponents. The need to fight against superior numbers would have required either exceptional tactical skill or extraordinary good fortune to achieve victory. The battle itself was fought with the brutal intensity that characterized early medieval warfare, where personal combat between heavily armed warriors determined the fate of kingdoms. Anglo-Saxon combat doctrine emphasized the decisive clash of shield walls, massive formations of warriors armed with spears and shields, who advanced in disciplined ranks until the opposing lines met in the kind of hand-to-hand fighting that tested every aspect of warrior training and personal courage. The famous Anglo-Saxon shield wall formation represented the pinnacle of early medieval infantry tactics, requiring perfect coordination between warriors who had trained together for years and who trusted their companions with their lives. Success in shield wall combat depended not just on individual skill and courage, but on the ability to maintain formation under the tremendous physical and psychological pressure of close quarters fighting, where a single moment of weakness could create gaps that enemy warriors could exploit to devastating effect. The psychological aspects of shield wall combat were as important as the physical elements, with victory often going to the side that could maintain morale and discipline under conditions of almost unimaginable stress and terror. The clash of weapons against shields, the screams of wounded men, and the sight of friends and enemies falling created an environment that tested human endurance to its absolute limits. The ability to function effectively in such conditions marked the difference between veteran warriors and inexperienced recruits. Contemporary sources provide frustratingly little detail about the actual fighting at Cirencester, but the outcome was devastatingly clear. Penda achieved a comprehensive victory that forced Cynegils to accept terms that amounted to the effective end of West Saxon independence in central England. The agreement mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle appears to have been a diplomatic euphemism for what was essentially a dictated peace that transferred control of Cirencester and probably substantial surrounding territory to permanent Mercian rule. The loss of Cirencester represented far more than a simple military defeat. It marked the effective end of West Saxon expansion northward and the establishment of a new balance of power that would shape English politics for the remainder of the 7th century. Penda's victory confirmed Mercia's status as the dominant force in central England, while reducing Wessex to a secondary power forced to accept the reality of Mercian hegemony in any future political calculations. The territorial losses that accompanied this defeat were substantial and permanent, depriving Wessex of rich agricultural lands and strategic positions that had been part of the kingdom since the early days of Anglo-Saxon settlement. These losses not only reduced royal revenues, but also eliminated sources of rewards that kings traditionally used to maintain warrior loyalty, creating internal political pressures that would complicate future military and diplomatic initiatives. The aftermath of Cirencester forced Cynegils to fundamentally reconsider his kingdom's strategic position and political options in a dramatically changed environment. With expansion blocked by Mercian power in the north and continuing British resistance in the west, Wessex faced the prospect of being squeezed between hostile forces on multiple fronts. The traditional Anglo-Saxon solution of conquering new territory to provide rewards for warriors was no longer readily available, requiring new approaches to the fundamental challenges of maintaining royal authority and kingdom stability. This strategic crisis coincided with the arrival of new influences that would ultimately transform not just Wessex, but the entire religious and cultural landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. The failure of traditional military solutions to the challenges facing his kingdom may have made Cynegils more receptive to alternative approaches, including diplomatic and religious innovations that promised new sources of strength and legitimacy for royal authority. The arrival of Bishop Birinus in Wessex around 634 marked the beginning of one of the most profound and transformative events in English history, a spiritual revolution that would fundamentally alter not just the religious landscape of the West Saxon kingdom, but the very foundations of royal authority, social organization, cultural identity, and the relationship between earthly power and divine will that had governed Anglo-Saxon society since the first Germanic settlers arrived in post-Roman Britain. This remarkable individual, carrying with him the revolutionary message of Christianity that had already transformed much of the European continent, represented far more than a simple missionary seeking converts in a distant pagan land. Birinus embodied the sophisticated evangelical apparatus of the 7th century Roman Church, an institution that had developed detailed and proven strategies for approaching pagan societies and their rulers with a message that promised not just personal salvation, but fundamental transformation of entire civilizations. The bishop's commission came directly from Pope Honorius I, one of the most influential pontiffs of the early medieval period, who had specifically charged him with carrying the gospel message to the inner parts beyond the English, a phrase that suggests his original destination was intended to be even more remote than Wessex, possibly among the Germanic tribes who still controlled much of continental Europe. Yet, When this dedicated and skillful missionary encountered the thoroughly pagan society of the West Saxons, he recognized an opportunity that demanded immediate attention and a fundamental revision of his original plans. Birinus brought with him credentials that commanded respect even in pagan courts, where Christian beliefs were unknown or actively opposed. His consecration as a bishop by Asterius at Genoa provided him with the highest level of ecclesiastical authority, while his evident education and sophistication marked him as a representative of the broader Christian civilization that was flourishing throughout much of Europe. These qualifications were crucial in gaining access to royal courts, where decisions about religious matters ultimately rested with kings, who had to consider both spiritual and political implications of any major changes. The strategic importance of converting royal houses was well understood by experienced missionaries like Birinus, who recognized that the transformation of entire kingdoms required the active support of political authorities rather than simple grassroots evangelization among common people. The conversion of a king could lead to the rapid Christianization of his entire realm, while royal opposition could make missionary work virtually impossible, regardless of popular sentiment. The Roman Church had by this time developed sophisticated approaches to pagan conversion that had proven successful in transforming the Frankish kingdoms and other Germanic societies across Europe. These strategies typically involved initial contact with royal courts, careful study of local customs and beliefs, identification of similarities between pagan and Christian practices that could serve as bridges to the new faith, and gradual introduction of Christian concepts in ways that respected existing cultural patterns while slowly transforming them from within. The Wessex that greeted Birinus was a society still completely rooted in traditional Germanic paganism, where ancient gods maintained their hold over the hearts and minds of everyone from the humblest farmer to the king himself. Sacred groves and springs dotted the landscape like natural cathedrals, while the royal court maintained priests and wise men who preserved religious traditions that stretched back through centuries of oral transmission to the earliest Germanic settlements in Britain. This pagan society was not the primitive barbarism that later Christian writers would sometimes describe, but a sophisticated religious system that provided meaning, structure, and identity for its adherents. The seasonal festivals that marked the agricultural year were tied to ancient deities whose worship connected human communities to the natural world in profound and meaningful ways. The warrior culture that dominated aristocratic society was saturated with religious symbolism, drawn from the pantheon of Germanic gods, while royal authority itself was understood to flow from divine sources that legitimized the right to rule. Yet this apparently impregnable fortress of traditional belief contained vulnerabilities that a skilled missionary could potentially exploit. The political disasters of the previous decade had shaken confidence in the protective power of the old gods, raising questions about their continued effectiveness in an era of military defeats and territorial losses. The obvious prosperity and military success of Christian kingdoms like Kent and Northumbria demonstrated that the new faith could coexist with political achievement, while the sophisticated culture and learning associated with Christianity offered attractions that purely pagan societies could not match. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the material prosperity and cultural sophistication of Christian courts, where continental connections brought exotic luxury goods, advanced technologies, and intellectual achievements that impressed even skeptical pagan observers. The contrast between the isolation of pagan kingdoms and the international connections of Christian realms provided practical arguments for conversion that complemented the spiritual appeals of missionary preaching. Birinus's approach to his missionary work demonstrated both tactical sophistication and genuine spiritual conviction that marked him as one of the most effective evangelists of his generation. Rather than launching a frontal assault on pagan beliefs that might provoke hostile reactions, he appears to have begun by establishing relationships with key figures in West Saxon society and demonstrating through his own behavior and teaching the practical benefits of Christian faith. The process of gaining access to Cynegils' court would have required careful navigation of the complex protocols that governed relationships between foreign dignitaries and Anglo-Saxon royalty. Birinus would have needed credible introductions from trusted intermediaries, perhaps merchants or diplomatic contacts who could vouch for his legitimacy and peaceful intentions. The bishop's evident learning and sophisticated manner would have helped establish his credibility as a representative of advanced European civilization. Initial conversations between Birinus and members of the West Saxon court would have focused on areas of common interest and mutual respect, rather than immediate challenges to fundamental beliefs. The bishop's knowledge of continental politics, his understanding of military and diplomatic developments across Europe, and his familiarity with royal courts and their customs would have made him a valuable source of information and counsel, even for those who remained skeptical of his religious message. The intellectual appeal of Christianity represented one of its most powerful attractions for sophisticated pagans who had limited access to the learning and literacy that characterized Christian civilization. The new faith brought with it not just spiritual teachings, but an entire educational tradition that included written literature, scientific knowledge, historical chronicles, and philosophical speculation that dwarfed anything available in purely oral cultures. The practical benefits of literacy alone provided compelling arguments for Christian conversion, as written records offered obvious advantages for government administration, legal proceedings, diplomatic correspondence, and commercial transactions. Royal courts that adopted Christianity gained access to educated clergy who could serve as secretaries, advisors, and diplomatic representatives, while Christian connections opened trade relationships and political alliances that were unavailable to pagan kingdoms. The theological content of Birinus' teaching would have been carefully adapted to his pagan audience, emphasizing aspects of Christian doctrine that resonated with existing Germanic beliefs, while gradually introducing concepts that challenged traditional assumptions. The Christian emphasis on divine kingship, for example, would have appealed to rulers who already understood their authority as flowing from supernatural sources, while the promise of eternal life for faithful warriors could be presented as superior to the pagan conception of Valhalla. The moral teachings of Christianity, with their emphasis on justice, mercy, and protection of the weak, offered attractive alternatives to purely warrior-based value systems that sometimes struggle to provide guidance for the complex challenges of governing settled agricultural societies. The Christian concept of divine judgment provided ultimate sanctions for royal law that could supplement traditional enforcement mechanisms based on kinship obligations and personal loyalty. The gradual process by which Birinus gained influence within the West Saxon court reflects the patience and skill required for successful missionary work among sophisticated pagan societies. The bishop would have needed to demonstrate not just the truth of his religious teachings, but their practical value for solving real-world problems that concerned royal advisors and court officials. Personal relationships played crucial roles in this evangelization process, as individual conversions within the royal circle created networks of Christian influence that could gradually expand throughout the court hierarchy. The conversion of influential nobles, skilled craftsmen, or foreign visitors could provide examples of Christian life that were more compelling than abstract theological arguments, while mixed marriages between Christians and pagans created opportunities for religious influence within the most intimate family relationships. The international context of Birinus' mission provided important leverage for his evangelical efforts, as the growing power and sophistication of Christian kingdoms across Europe demonstrated the practical advantages of conversion. The military successes of rulers like Dagobert of the Franks or the cultural achievements of Christian courts provided object lessons in the benefits of adopting the new faith, while the isolation of pagan kingdoms became increasingly apparent as Christian realms developed closer relationships with each other. The symbolic power of Christian rituals and material culture offered additional tools for missionary persuasion, as elaborate church ceremonies, beautiful religious art, and impressive church architecture provided sensory experiences that could complement intellectual arguments for conversion. The contrast between simple pagan rites and sophisticated Christian liturgies demonstrated the superior resources and organizational capabilities of the new faith. Economic considerations also influenced the reception of Christianity within pagan courts, as Christian merchants and craftsmen often possessed superior skills and broader trade connections that could benefit entire kingdoms. The conversion of royal houses typically led to increased contact with Christian trading networks and access to luxury goods and advanced technologies that were unavailable through purely pagan channels. The personal character and evident sincerity of Birinus himself played crucial roles in establishing the credibility of his message and gaining the respect of skeptical pagan audiences. His willingness to leave his homeland and risk his life to spread his faith demonstrated a level of commitment that impressed even those who disagreed with his teachings, while his learning and sophisticated manner established his credentials as a representative of advanced European civilization. The timing of Birinus' arrival in Wessex proved particularly favorable for his missionary efforts, as Cynegils was facing unprecedented challenges to his kingdom's independence and security that traditional approaches had failed to resolve. The recent military defeats and territorial losses may have created openness to new ideas and alternative sources of divine support that might restore West Saxon fortunes and provide fresh approaches to the kingdom's mounting problems. The stage was thus set for one of the most remarkable conversions in English history, as a pagan warrior king who had spent his entire life worshipping the ancient gods of his Germanic ancestors prepared to encounter a revolutionary new faith that would transform not just his personal beliefs, but the entire destiny of his kingdom and the emerging English nation. The conversion of King Cynegils stands as one of the most pivotal moments in English history, a spiritual transformation that marked not just the personal journey of one remarkable ruler, but the beginning of England's emergence as a Christian nation. The sacred waters of baptism that washed over the West Saxon king in 635 carried away more than the stains of sin. They cleansed an entire civilization of its pagan past and opened the doorway to a future that would see England become one of the most important centers of Christian learning and culture in all of Europe. The process that led to this historic moment had been unfolding gradually over months of careful conversation, theological instruction, and political negotiation between Bishop Birinus and the royal court. The conversion of a king was never a simple matter of personal spiritual conviction, but required consideration of complex political implications that could affect the stability of the entire kingdom and its relationships with neighboring rulers. Cynegils had to balance his growing attraction to the Christian message against the potential consequences of abandoning the religious traditions that had legitimized his authority and bound his people together for centuries. The theological instruction that prepared Cynegils for baptism would have been comprehensive and sophisticated, covering not just the basic principles of Christian doctrine, but the practical implications of conversion for royal governance and social organization. Birinus would have explained the Christian understanding of divine kingship, showing how earthly rulers could serve as instruments of God's will while maintaining their authority and effectiveness as political leaders. This teaching represented a fundamental shift from pagan conceptions of royal authority, while offering continuity with traditional expectations of divine favor and supernatural support. The question of whether other members of the royal family would join the king in conversion added additional complexity to the decision-making process. The sources suggest that Cynegils' son Cuicum was also baptized around this time, indicating that the royal conversion involved multiple generations and represented a dynastic commitment to the new faith, rather than simply an individual spiritual journey. This family dimension of the conversion ensured that Christianity would have strong institutional support within the royal house while reducing the risk of future reversions to paganism. The international diplomatic implications of conversion were equally significant, as Cynegils' adoption of Christianity would align Wessex with the growing community of Christian kingdoms across Europe, while potentially creating tensions with pagan neighbours like Mercia. The bishop's connections to the continental church provided opportunities for new alliances and trade relationships that could compensate for any losses resulting from strained relations with pagan allies. The presence of King Oswald of Northumbria as godfather to Cynegils during the baptism ceremony added enormous weight and significance to the conversion, transforming what might have been a purely local religious event into a matter of international importance. Oswald was already recognized as one of the most powerful and successful Christian rulers in Britain, his military victories and political achievements providing compelling evidence of the practical benefits of Christian faith. His willingness to serve as godfather created a personal bond between the two kings that had profound political as well as spiritual implications. The relationship between Oswald and Cynegils, that was formalized through the baptism ceremony, appears to have been sealed by a marriage alliance between Oswald and one of Cynegils' daughters, probably the princess known as Cinebert. This diplomatic marriage connected the two royal houses in ways that would influence Anglo-Saxon politics for generations, while providing Wessex with a powerful Christian ally who could offer protection against the growing threat of Mercian expansion. The baptism ceremony itself took place at Dorchester-on-Thames, a strategically important location that would become the first episcopal seat in Wessex and the centre of Christian missionary activity throughout the kingdom. The choice of Dorchester was significant for multiple reasons. Its position on the Thames provided easy access for visiting dignitaries. Its location within traditional West Saxon territory demonstrated royal commitment to the new faith, and its existing importance as a royal centre ensured that the ceremony would receive maximum visibility and impact. The physical setting of the baptism would have been carefully prepared to create maximum dramatic impact while incorporating elements that honoured both Christian tradition and Anglo-Saxon cultural expectations. The ceremony likely took place near the River Thames itself, with the flowing waters providing natural symbolism for the spiritual cleansing that was taking place. Temporary structures may have been erected to accommodate the large crowd of witnesses who would have gathered to observe this historic moment. The baptismal liturgy used by Birinus would have followed established Roman practices while being adapted to the specific circumstances of converting a pagan king and his followers. The ceremony would have included formal renunciation of pagan gods and practices, public profession of Christian faith, and the actual baptism by immersion or effusion that symbolized death to sin and rebirth in Christ. These elements combined to create a powerful ritual that marked a complete break with the past and commitment to a new spiritual future. The presence of a large crowd of witnesses, including both Christian and pagan observers, transformed the baptism into a public declaration of royal policy that committed the entire kingdom to supporting the new faith. The assembled nobles, warriors, and commoners who witnessed their king's conversion understood that they were observing not just a personal spiritual journey, but a political transformation that would affect every aspect of their lives. The symbolic elements of the baptism ceremony would have been chosen to resonate with both Christian theological principles and Anglo-Saxon cultural values. The use of water for ritual purification had precedence in pagan religious practices, while the emphasis on divine kingship and supernatural favor connected Christian concepts to existing beliefs about royal authority. The presence of powerful political allies like Oswald demonstrated that conversion brought practical as well as spiritual benefits. The immediate aftermath of the baptism saw a remarkable transformation in the religious landscape of Wessex as Cynegils moved quickly to establish institutional support for the new faith throughout his kingdom. The king granted Dorchester to Bishop Birinus as his episcopal seat, providing the missionary with a secure base for future evangelization efforts, while demonstrating royal commitment to supporting Christian institutions. The establishment of the first Christian churches in Wessex represented a massive undertaking that required significant financial resources and skilled craftsmen who could adapt continental architectural traditions to local conditions and materials. These early churches served not just as places of worship, but as centers of learning and administration that would gradually transform West Saxon culture and society. The conversion of the royal court created a ripple effect throughout West Saxon society, as nobles and officials sought to demonstrate their loyalty to the new religious dispensation, while positioning themselves to benefit from the opportunities that Christian civilization offered. The adoption of Christian practices became a mark of social advancement and political favor, while resistance to the new faith increasingly marked individuals as potential obstacles to royal policy. The process of training native clergy to serve the growing Christian community required the establishment of educational institutions that could provide both religious instruction and the literacy skills necessary for effective church administration. Birinus and his assistants would have begun immediately to identify promising candidates for ordination, while establishing the schools and scriptoria that would preserve and transmit Christian learning throughout the kingdom. The introduction of Christian marriage practices represented one of the most visible changes in social organization that followed royal conversion. Christian concepts of monogamy and the sanctity of marriage vows challenged traditional Anglo-Saxon practices regarding divorce, polygamy, and political marriage alliances, requiring careful navigation of conflicts between religious principles and political necessities. The economic implications of Christianization were equally significant, as the new faith brought with it different approaches to trade craftsmanship and social organization that would gradually transform West Saxon society. Christian merchants and craftsmen possessed skills and connections that could benefit the entire kingdom, while Christian concepts of charity and social responsibility created new expectations about royal duties and obligations. The cultural transformation that accompanied religious conversion extended to every aspect of artistic and intellectual life, as Christian themes and symbolism began to influence everything from royal regalia to domestic decoration. The synthesis of Germanic artistic traditions with Christian iconography would eventually produce some of the most beautiful and sophisticated art in early medieval Europe. The strategic advantages that Cynegils gained through conversion extended far beyond simple alliance with Northumbria to include access to the broader network of Christian kingdoms that was developing across Europe. These connections provided opportunities for trade, learning, and diplomatic cooperation that were unavailable to purely pagan rulers, while Christian merchants and pilgrims brought knowledge and resources that enhanced royal power and prestige. The psychological impact of royal conversion on both Christian and pagan populations throughout Britain cannot be underestimated, as Cynegils' example demonstrated that powerful and successful rulers could embrace the new faith without losing their effectiveness or authority. This precedent encouraged other Anglo-Saxon kings to consider conversion, while undermining arguments that Christianity was incompatible with warrior culture and political success. The long-term consequences of Cynegils' conversion would extend far beyond his own lifetime to influence the development of English Christianity for centuries to come. The institutional foundations established during his reign would survive the political upheavals that followed his death, while the precedent of royal Christianity would eventually lead to the complete Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England and its emergence as one of the most important centers of medieval Christian civilization. The transformation of Wessex from a pagan kingdom into a Christian realm under Cynegils' leadership represented one of the most profound and far-reaching changes in early English history, affecting not just religious practices, but every aspect of social organization, cultural expression, economic activity, and political relationships that defined life in 7th century Anglo-Saxon society. This remarkable metamorphosis unfolded gradually over the final years of Cynegils' reign, as the king and his advisors worked systematically to establish institutional foundations for the new faith, while carefully managing the complex process of cultural transition that touched the lives of every person in the kingdom. The establishment of Bishop Birinus at Dorchester-on-Thames as the first bishop of the West Saxons marked the beginning of organized Christian administration in Wessex, creating institutional structures that could support and guide the conversion process throughout the kingdom. The choice of Dorchester as the episcopal centre reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. Its strategic location on the Thames provided easy communication with other Christian centres, while its position within traditional West Saxon territory demonstrated royal commitment to making Christianity an integral part of kingdom identity rather than simply a foreign import. The construction of the first Christian churches in Wessex required massive investments of royal resources and represented visible symbols of the kingdom's new religious orientation that could be seen and understood by everyone from the highest noble to the humblest farmer. These early churches followed architectural traditions that had been developed in other Christian kingdoms, but they were adapted to local conditions and materials in ways that created distinctively English forms of church architecture that would influence religious building throughout the medieval period. The cathedral church at Dorchester would have been the most impressive of these early Christian buildings, designed to serve not just as Bishop Birinus' headquarters, but as a demonstration of royal power and Christian sophistication that could compete with the most magnificent pagan temples or royal halls. The construction of such a building required skilled craftsmen who understood both traditional Anglo-Saxon building techniques and continental church architecture, creating opportunities for cultural exchange and technological transfer that benefited the entire kingdom. The process of training native clergy to serve the growing Christian community represented one of the most crucial and challenging aspects of establishing institutional Christianity in Wessex. Bishop Birinus and his assistants had to identify promising candidates for ordination from among a population with no previous experience of Christian education or clerical life, while simultaneously establishing the schools and educational institutions necessary to provide proper training for future church leaders. The introduction of literacy as an essential requirement for effective church administration had profound implications that extended far beyond purely religious concerns to influence legal procedures, administrative practices, and cultural development throughout West Saxon society. The ability to read and write Latin opened access to the accumulated wisdom of Christian civilization, while providing practical tools for government and commerce that enhance royal power and economic development. The establishment of scriptoria, where manuscripts could be copied and preserved, ensured that Christian learning would take root permanently in Wessex, while creating centers of intellectual activity that attracted scholars and students from throughout Anglo-Saxon England. These early scriptoria would eventually produce some of the most beautiful and important manuscripts in medieval European history, including illuminated gospels and scholarly works that preserved both Christian doctrine and classical learning for future generations. The gradual conversion of the West Saxon nobility created a new Christian aristocracy, whose loyalty to both king and faith reinforced the institutional foundations of the new religious dispensation. These converted nobles served as examples for their own followers, while providing the political and economic support necessary for building churches, supporting clergy, and establishing the charitable institutions that were essential elements of Christian society. The transformation of royal ceremonial and court culture to incorporate Christian elements while maintaining traditional Anglo-Saxon practices required careful balancing of religious principles with political necessities. Christian blessing of royal authority supplemented rather than replaced traditional concepts of divine kingship, while church ceremonies provided new opportunities for displaying royal magnificence and reinforcing political relationships with both domestic and foreign allies. The introduction of Christian marriage practices represented one of the most visible and socially significant changes that accompanied religious conversion, as new concepts of monogamy and the sanctity of marriage vows challenged traditional Anglo-Saxon approaches to political alliances and family relationships. The Church's emphasis on the indissolubility of marriage created potential conflicts with political needs for flexible alliance strategies, requiring careful negotiation between religious principles and practical governance requirements. The development of Christian charitable institutions reflected both religious obligations and practical needs for social welfare that had previously been met through traditional kinship networks and royal gift-giving. Christian concepts of care for the poor, sick, and disadvantaged created new expectations about royal and noble responsibilities, while providing alternative sources of support for those who fell outside traditional social protection systems. The economic implications of Christianization extended throughout West Saxon society, as new religious institutions required ongoing financial support, while Christian merchants and craftsmen brought advanced skills and broader trade connections that enhance overall prosperity. The construction and maintenance of churches required specialized craftsmen, whose skills could be applied to secular as well as religious projects, while Christian trade networks provided access to luxury goods and exotic materials that enhanced royal prestige. The synthesis of Germanic artistic traditions with Christian iconography and symbolism created new forms of cultural expression that reflected the unique character of English Christianity, while maintaining connections to both Anglo-Saxon heritage and broader European Christian civilization. This artistic fusion would eventually produce masterpieces like the Lindisfarne Gospels and other works that rank among the greatest achievements of medieval European art. The introduction of Christian concepts of time and history transformed West Saxon understanding of their place in the larger cosmic order, while providing new frameworks for interpreting political events and social changes. Christian chronology, based on the incarnation of Christ, replaced traditional methods of dating based on royal reigns or mythological events, while Christian historiography provided models for understanding the past that emphasized divine providence and moral instruction. The development of Christian legal concepts and judicial procedures gradually supplemented traditional Anglo-Saxon law codes based on compensation and kinship obligations with new principles derived from Christian morality and Roman legal traditions. This legal evolution would eventually produce sophisticated systems of jurisprudence that combined Germanic custom with Christian ethics and Roman administrative practices. The establishment of pilgrimage routes and religious festivals created new patterns of movement and interaction that connected Wessex more closely to other Christian kingdoms, while providing opportunities for cultural exchange and economic development. Christian pilgrims brought news, ideas, and resources from distant places, while West Saxon Christians, who travelled to other religious centres, served as ambassadors for their kingdom and faith. The transformation of seasonal celebrations and agricultural festivals from pagan to Christian observances required careful adaptation of existing traditions to new religious meanings, while maintaining the social cohesion and cultural continuity that these celebrations provided. Christmas, Easter, and other Christian holidays gradually replaced pagan festivals, while incorporating elements that preserve community traditions and seasonal rhythms. The introduction of Christian education for women represented a significant departure from traditional Anglo-Saxon practices, while creating new opportunities for female participation in religious and intellectual life. Christian convents provided alternatives to marriage for royal and noble daughters, while creating centres of female learning that would produce some of the most remarkable women in medieval European history. The development of diplomatic relationships with other Christian kingdoms based on shared religious identity supplemented traditional alliance systems based on kinship and military necessity with new forms of international cooperation. These Christian diplomatic networks provided opportunities for peaceful resolution of conflicts while creating common interests that transcended traditional ethnic and political boundaries. The gradual penetration of Christian influence into rural areas beyond the immediate reach of royal courts required patient missionary work among agricultural communities whose daily lives remained closely tied to traditional seasonal rhythms and local customs. The success of this rural evangelization depended on the ability of Christian teachers to demonstrate the practical relevance of their message, while respecting established community traditions. The preservation and transmission of both Christian doctrine and traditional Anglo-Saxon culture through the new medium of written literature created opportunities for cultural synthesis that would profoundly influence the development of English literary traditions. The writing down of oral traditions, laws, and historical memories in Christian scriptoria ensured their preservation while subjecting them to new interpretive frameworks that reflected Christian values and perspectives. The long-term stability of Christian institutions in Wessex depended on their ability to survive the political upheavals and dynastic changes that were characteristic of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, while maintaining their essential religious character and mission. The institutional foundations established during Cynegils' reign would be tested by subsequent crises, but would ultimately prove strong enough to support the continued development of English Christianity through centuries of political change and social transformation. As Cynegils approached the end of his remarkable reign in the early 640s, he could look back upon achievements that had fundamentally transformed not only his own kingdom of Wessex, but the entire trajectory of English civilization. The pagan warrior who had ascended the throne in 611 had become the founding father of English Christianity, the king whose conversion opened the floodgates for a spiritual revolution that would sweep across Anglo-Saxon England and establish the institutional foundations for medieval Christendom in Britain. The final years of Cynegils' reign were marked by the consolidation of Christian institutions throughout Wessex and the careful preparation for succession that would ensure the survival of his religious and political innovations beyond his own lifetime. The king understood that the transformation he had initiated was still fragile and could easily be reversed by a pagan successor or undermined by political crises that might weaken royal authority and create opportunities for traditionalist reactions against the new faith. The establishment of secure funding for Christian institutions represented one of Cynegils' most important late-reign achievements, as he systematically granted lands and revenues to Bishop Birinus and his successors to ensure that the Church would have independent resources for maintaining clergy, constructing buildings, and supporting the educational and charitable activities that were essential to Christian civilization. These royal grants created the economic foundation for institutional Christianity in Wessex, while demonstrating royal commitment to the new faith in ways that could not easily be reversed by future rulers. The development of a native West Saxon clergy, trained in Christian doctrine and capable of conducting religious services without continuing dependence on foreign missionaries, marked another crucial step in establishing permanent foundations for English Christianity. Bishop Birinus had worked systematically throughout his years in Wessex to identify promising candidates for ordination, while establishing the educational institutions necessary to provide proper training for future church leaders. These early West Saxon clergymen represented a remarkable synthesis of Germanic cultural traditions with Christian learning and devotion, creating a uniquely English form of Christianity that would influence religious development throughout medieval Europe. Their ability to communicate Christian doctrine in the Anglo-Saxon language, while maintaining connections to continental learning, ensured that English Christianity would be both culturally relevant and intellectually sophisticated. The construction projects initiated during Cynegils' reign continued throughout his final years as Christian churches, monasteries, and educational institutions spread throughout the kingdom and created visible symbols of the new religious dispensation. These buildings represented massive investments of royal resources and skilled labor, while providing lasting monuments to the transformation that had taken place under Cynegils' leadership. The most significant of these construction projects was the expansion and enhancement of the cathedral complex at Dorchester-on-Thames, which served as the administrative centre of West Saxon Christianity and the symbolic heart of the kingdom's new religious identity. The cathedral precinct included not just the main church building, but also residential quarters for clergy, educational facilities for training future priests, scriptoria for copying manuscripts, and workshops for producing the religious artifacts necessary for Christian worship. The international relationships that Cynegils had cultivated through his conversion and alliance with Northumbria continued to bear fruit in his final years as Wessex became increasingly integrated into the broader network of Christian kingdoms that was developing across Europe. These connections provided opportunities for cultural exchange, economic cooperation, and diplomatic coordination that enhanced West Saxon prestige while strengthening the institutional foundations of English Christianity. The marriage of Cynegils' daughter to King Oswald of Northumbria had created lasting bonds between the two kingdoms that transcended the personal relationships of individual rulers to establish patterns of cooperation that would influence Anglo-Saxon politics for generations. This diplomatic marriage demonstrated the practical benefits of Christian conversion, while creating a powerful precedent for using religious affinity as a foundation for political alliance. The gradual transformation of West Saxon law and legal procedures to incorporate Christian principles represented another significant aspect of Cynegils' late reign achievements. Christian concepts of justice, mercy, and moral responsibility gradually supplemented traditional Anglo-Saxon legal traditions based on compensation and kinship obligations, creating more sophisticated approaches to governance that would influence English legal development for centuries to come. The introduction of Christian charity and social welfare institutions provided new mechanisms for addressing poverty, disease, and social disruption that had previously been handled through traditional kinship networks and royal gift-giving. These Christian charitable organizations created more systematic and reliable sources of support for society's most vulnerable members while demonstrating the practical benefits of Christian civilization. The development of Christian educational institutions throughout Wessex ensured that literacy and learning would become integral parts of West Saxon culture rather than simply foreign imports that might disappear with changing political circumstances. These schools and scriptoria created centres of intellectual activity that attracted students and scholars from throughout Anglo-Saxon England, while preserving and transmitting both Christian doctrine and classical learning. The question of succession planning occupied much of Cynegils' attention during his final years as he worked to ensure that his son Cynwal would be prepared to continue the policies and innovations that had transformed Wessex into a Christian kingdom. This preparation involved both practical training in governance and Christian education that would enable the prince to serve effectively as a Christian king while maintaining the military and political skills necessary for successful Anglo-Saxon rulership. The relationship between father and son during this transition period appears to have been marked by careful consultation and gradual assumption of responsibilities that prepared Cynwal for the challenges he would face as king. The sources suggest that Cynegils took great care to explain not just the practical aspects of Christian governance, but the spiritual foundations that had motivated his own conversion and transformation. The celebration of Christian festivals and the establishment of religious calendar observances throughout Wessex created new rhythms of communal life that reinforced Christian identity, while providing alternatives to traditional pagan celebrations. Christmas, Easter, and other major Christian holidays gradually became focal points for royal ceremony and popular celebration that demonstrated the kingdom's new religious orientation. The death of Cynegils in 643 marked the end of one of the most transformative reigns in Anglo-Saxon history, but the institutions and traditions he had established ensured that his achievements would survive and continue to influence English development for centuries to come. The king's passing was mourned throughout Wessex and beyond, as Christian and pagan observers alike recognized that a truly remarkable ruler had departed from the earthly stage. The funeral arrangements for Cynegils reflected both his royal status and his Christian faith. As traditional Anglo-Saxon burial customs were modified to incorporate Christian elements that demonstrated the kingdom's new religious orientation. The king was buried with ceremonies that honored both his achievements as a warrior king and his pioneering role as the first Christian ruler of Wessex. The location chosen for Cynegils' burial was symbolic of his dual identity as both Anglo-Saxon king and Christian convert, positioned to honor traditional royal burial practices while acknowledging the new faith that had transformed his reign. Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, provided a setting that connected the Christian king to the long line of pagan predecessors who had established and maintained West Saxon independence. The immediate aftermath of Cynegils' death tested the strength of the institutions he had established as his son. Cynwal faced the challenges of maintaining Christian policy while dealing with the political and military pressures that characterized 7th century Anglo-Saxon kingship. The successful transition to Christian leadership under Cynwal demonstrated that Cynegils' innovations had created lasting changes rather than temporary modifications that depended entirely on his personal authority. The long-term consequences of Cynegils' conversion and the institutional foundations he established would extend far beyond the borders of Wessex to influence the development of Christianity throughout Anglo-Saxon England. His example encouraged other kings to consider conversion, while providing practical models for establishing Christian institutions and managing the transition from pagan to Christian society. The scholarly and cultural achievements that grew from the educational institutions established during Cynegils' reign would eventually make England one of the most important centers of learning in medieval Europe. The scriptoria and schools founded during his lifetime would produce generations of scholars, missionaries, and administrators who would spread English Christian influence throughout Europe, while preserving and transmitting the cultural heritage of both classical antiquity and Germanic tradition. The synthesis of Anglo-Saxon and Christian traditions that began during Cynegils' reign would create distinctively English forms of art, literature and religious practice that would influence European civilization for centuries. The Lindisfarne Gospels, the poetry of Caedmon, and later vernacular religious literature, and the distinctive architecture of Anglo-Saxon churches all trace their origins to the cultural transformation initiated by Cynegils' conversion. The precedent of royal Christianity established by Cynegils would eventually lead to the complete Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England and the emergence of a unified English kingdom under Christian auspices. Alfred the Great's later achievements in defending and defining English Christian civilization built directly upon the foundations laid by Cynegils and other 7th century Christian kings who first established the institutional framework for English Christianity. The international influence of English Christianity, which would see Anglo-Saxon missionaries spreading their faith throughout Northern Europe, while English scholars contributed to the Carolingian Renaissance, grew from the institutional foundations and cultural synthesis that began during Cynegils' pioneering reign. The achievement of this remarkable king thus extends far beyond the boundaries of 7th century Wessex to influence the entire subsequent development of European Christian civilization. As we drift toward peaceful sleep on this gentle winter evening, we can reflect upon the extraordinary journey of Cynegils from pagan warrior to Christian king, from a ruler bound by ancient traditions to a visionary leader who opened his kingdom to transformation and renewal. His story reminds us that even in the darkest ages, individuals can make choices that illuminate the future and create foundations for civilization that endure across centuries. The sacred waters that baptized the first Christian king of Wessex continue to flow through English history, carrying forward the legacy of a remarkable ruler whose courage to embrace change transformed not just his own life, but the destiny of an entire nation. In the gentle whispers of those ancient waters, we can still hear echoes of the moment when England first opened its heart to the light of Christian faith. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams carry you back to that distant time when a pagan king knelt in sacred waters and rose as the founder of English Christianity, beginning a transformation that would shape the destiny of nations and the faith of millions yet unborn.